Our presenter this evening is Craig Smith, who is an OUBS alumni. Craig is a culture change facilitator and a co-author of the B book. Some of you will have seen the competition we've got, and Craig very kindly donated some books to us. He supports leading organisations across the world, and he helps them to feel more connected, agile, and get their mojo back. Craig has produced a powerful toolkit of services over the years, and he will share some of his experiences with us tonight. I'm just going to open up Craig's presentation because he's sharing his screen with us tonight. Craig, I've just opened it up for you. And I'd now like to hand over to Craig, who will tell you a bit more about his background. So over to you, Craig.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can. That's lovely. Thank you, Craig.
Good. I just thought I'd double check. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for being on the webinar. It's a pleasure to spend the time with you for the next half an hour or so. So I'm going to keep an eye on the clock. I know I've got about half an hour to speak, maybe 25 minutes, and then we'll take some questions for 10, 15 minutes. Depending on how many we've got. I know Janet said that you've got a polling option there, where you've got an opportunity to put your hand up virtually. If any of you do want to ask a question, I think what we're going to try and do is take them not instantly throughout the presentation, obviously, because that will slow us down, but we'll probably pause at certain points and catch up and see which questions we've got. So if anyone would like to ask any questions, please feel free, and obviously we'll have some time at the end to cover them. So let me just quickly talk you through the format for tonight. I'll give you a little bit of an overview about who I am. Janet's already given you some background to who I am and a little bit about what I do. I'm going to explain why I care about this stuff being engagement and bringing the spark back into organisations, and the type of organisations I work with and how we do that. I'm going to share with you some data. Some of you will be familiar with it already, I'm sure, as to why employee engagement, engaging our people, is important, and there's lots of metrics around that, and I'm just going to share some of the data around that. And then a couple of short sessions, how some organisations get it wrong, and with that I'm sort of being very honest and open in that I've made some of the mistakes that I'll be talking about in my career, and I'll be very open about that. And then just also how others are getting it right, and some of the things that we see working really well in some of our client organisations, and also with some of the companies that we partner with to deliver our work. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So, who am I? Well, there's a bit more of an up-to-date picture of me. I think the one that Janet had on the front end was my LinkedIn picture, or one of my older LinkedIn pictures. So that was taken about 4 or 5 years ago. So it was a bit disingenuous to not update that. So that's me. That's what I look like.
Can I just
who have I worked for?
Sorry to interrupt you. We're not seeing the slides move on. Are they moving on for you?
They are. Which one are you on at the moment?
We're still on the bring the spark back to your organisation. I'll flip back to the welcome one, and then we'll try again with sharing your desktop. Just bear with me, everybody. I apologise. Okay. Sure. Okay. Let's go back. Now we're still getting that same picture.
Oh, let me try again. Okay. Apologies for this. So it's got hosting is paused when I go back to the collaborate screen. What can you see now?
We're still seeing that same screen, unfortunately. Let's go here.
I've not got that on my screen at the moment. Let me close my presentation software down.
Okay.
So it's definitely not running now. It's definitely off from my end.
Right. Okay. Let's try again. I do apologise for this, everybody. We're not sure it worked as usual. It worked perfectly in rehearsal.
Worked fine in the practice.
Oh, yeah. I'm still seeing that screen. I wonder. I'm going to stop the sharing for the moment. Please bear with us, everybody. I do apologise for this. I'm also going to stop the recording for a moment.
The old adage of never working with technology, children or animals is correct. Okay.
Absolutely.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
So, There we go. No problem. There we go. There's the updated picture. I'll get past that as quickly as possible. Catch up to where I was going to be. So these are some of the organisations I've worked with. I started my career with Tarmac. I've worked with private utility companies just after privatisation in the early 90s. Royal Mail, PepsiCo. They're pretty much the core of my career. And I've got an MBA from the OU, which is probably one of my proudest achievements in life. So I share that pride with you of being part of the OU family. I started my own business 9 years ago, Flint Spark Consulting, and as some of you already know, just recently released a book, the B Book. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, just about how that fits in with the presentation and what we're talking about today, about this whole idea of bringing your spark back. So, okay. For those of you who've seen the video on YouTube, the famous TED Talk by Simon Sinek, I like to use this as a bit of a framework to explain to people when I'm working with new people what I do, how I do it, and why I do it. So what do? Well, I guess I'm an OD consultant, organizational development consultant, culture change facilitator is my funky title. I work with organizations to try and help them to improve employee engagement, get their spark back, particularly organizations, larger organizations that have maybe come a little bit slowed down and have lost their way a little bit in terms of what it was they originally started out to do. How do I do that? Well, I've got a toolkit. I mainly work with, I use a lot of visual tools, so I do a lot of graphic facilitation, if any of you are familiar with that. I use graphic storyboards to help organizations share their story, share their vision with their employees and their stakeholders. And why do I do it? The fundamental question, well, I've worked in lots of different organizations, as you saw earlier. And I'm really, really passionate, and I passionately believe that everybody should have the opportunity to achieve everything they can in life, whether that's at work or at home or wherever. And I've seen lots of people counting down the days to their retirement, or can't wait to get out of the door every night when they've finished their shift or whatever it is they do, and just really, really dislike being at work. And I just think life's too short to not enjoy the 40% or 50, 60% of our lives that we actually spend earning a living. So I passionately believe that everybody should have the opportunity to be able to self-actualize, learn and grow, and actually enjoy themselves at work, and actually deliver something that they think is constructive and productive. So that's what I do, how I do, why I do it. Case for bringing your spark back. Well, I'm sure many of you already know that there are there's many reports been out there. If any of you want some data on this, I'd be happy to send you some links to various reports and surveys. If you go onto the internet, onto Google, and search for Gallup employee engagement data surveys, there's been a lot of their surveys published recently that indicate that both the level of engagement within organizations around the globe at the moment, but also the impact that engagement has on the bottom line. And I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the statistics relating to employee engagement. There's just a few on your screen now that you can see from Gallup's work. And companies, obviously within the top quartile of engagement, as you can see, demonstrate not only the things I've been talking about, happier, engaged, more engaged employees, but there is a bottom line improvement for that. Another piece of research or data that I'm quite interested in as well is this information here. So this was a report that came out from the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development in the UK last year, and this was an employee outlook report that they produced, which was looking at the varying factors that affect engagement within organizations. And I found this really, really interesting, and the correlation between the size of the business and the degree of engagement and the net satisfaction by sector and size of organization. And this works with fundamentally one of the principles that I have, which is all very much around, as organizations get larger, as they become more complex, so it becomes more difficult and more challenging them to engage their employees. There are outliers with that. Within that, I worked in an organisation myself which was very, very large and had very good levels of employee engagement. But generally speaking, there is a correlation between the smaller the business and the higher the levels of engagement. And particularly in very small businesses, in micro businesses, the magnitude is very high. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is particularly for larger organizations, how do they reconnect themselves with how it used to be when they were smaller? Every organization started at some point. There was a genesis, there was a beginning of that organization. And I call it the living above the shop effect. Not every business had this point, I'm sure. Not every business has a shop, so to speak. But every large business, at some point, there was the metaphor of everyone was connected. Everybody knew each other by their first name. There was a purpose. There was a sense of common direction and wanting to do something different that everyone had within the organization. And at a point in the future, as organizations grow, as teams get larger, the structures start to develop, and people become less and less connected and less engaged with each other and also with the purpose of the organization, and become very much more fixated on their own silos, their own small divisional or local targets, and this can be a real challenge. And an analogy I also use, apart from my living above the shop effect, is it's a little bit like evolution. Evolutionary theory states that at one point all life on Earth was single-celled organisms, and at some point they decided they were going to clump together for their mutual benefit, and then they develop into multicellular, larger organs and creatures where they form their own organs and specified. They all have their own specified function, and it's a little bit like that. So larger organizations are very good at being differentiated. There's a very high level of structure in them. That everything has a purpose and everything has its place. But the problem is with that is that trying to get those different areas to talk to each other can be quite challenging. And this follows the flow of the typical growth curve that organizations go through. I'm sure you're familiar with this through either your studies or your own experience, but the sigmoid curve, the growth curve, which again, all organisms, all human beings, all creatures go through these phases, and all organizations do. Every organization has a point at which it starts, which can sometimes be a bit bumpy, and then a growth period. It reaches maturity, and then it enters a period of decline. And again, it's when organizations are mature and starting to reach that cusp where they may be going into decline, which is where typically engagement tends to be a critical factor in terms of determining whether they continue that growth curve or whether they do enter a period of stagnation and potentially in the future decline. So I thought, you've heard enough from me for a few minutes. I thought we'd just have a little poll, because it'd be interesting for me to know where your organizations are at this moment in time in terms of that sigmoid curve. So, Janet, are you going to open up the survey
I
now?
am going to open the poll now. Just give me one moment. There we go. Okay, if you'd like to read through now, and then everybody can vote while you're reading through. Can you hear me, Craig?
I can hear you, yes, yeah.
Yep.
I'm just looking at the votes coming in now. So
oh, they're already coming in. Yep. Okay, that's good. While we're waiting for people to finish up, which is great, I actually wondered, as you were talking about the smaller and larger companies, do you think it's possibly because a double-edged thing that smaller companies, people are more engaged because perhaps they have more autonomy, or possibly even that they feel more valued and everybody knows each other?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that for me, that's that whole living above the shop effect. It is where, you know, we do have a sense of we can change things. We have control. We can exert control over the organisation. We have autonomy, and we have responsibility. And I think as organisations get larger, the correlation between the work that we do and the bottom line impact that has becomes further and further and more disconnected. And I think people often feel they're a very small cog in a very large machine, and that can contribute as well.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm going to publish the responses now, so hopefully you can see them. Right.
Yeah.
Most people have
quite
gone
a few
for
people couldn't
C.
find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Looks
Yeah,
like
there's a few haven't
few people
voted.
find the button. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we take that, yeah, I'm gonna take over
There's
back
a
to
few.
the.
There's a few in the chat box actually. There's a few C's there and a D. So whether that makes a difference. Oh, one D. Yes, there you go. Rob's gone D. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. Okay. So most organisations, it seems, are in a phase of maturity. Am I presenting again now? You're back to my screen, yeah?
You are now. Yes.
Okay. Great. So just to look at the implications for that, because I think it has an that the stage that your organisation at has an implication in terms of the degree, or as a result sometimes of the degree of leadership versus management. I'm not going to go into the definition of the two. I'm assuming that we have a consistent understanding of the difference between leadership and management. But what you often find is in a startup situation, there's a high level of leadership.
Craig,
Craig, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt again. We seem to have lost you again. We're stuck on the poll slide, so we may have to disengage and start again. So.
Okay. I'll help if I can help with that by stopping sharing and then resharing.
Apologies, everyone. It doesn't seem to like us switching screens tonight, so we'll just stop for the moment.
Okay.
And we can see your screen again now, so if you'd like to start presenting, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Sorry about that, everyone. Yeah, so the typical consequences of, or one of the consequences or causes of what we've just been talking about is the correlation between leadership and management. So as I was saying, in a startup, you tend to find high levels of leadership. There's a high sense of vision and direction and inspiration and lots of energy. However, that can be pretty chaotic because the levels of management, the levels of sophistication and process tends to be fairly low. As an organization grows, obviously it needs to be able to have repeatable processes. It needs to be able to satisfy the demand for its services or products, and that leads to a development of management, a high degree of management. So typically in a growth phase, we have a high level of leadership pushing the business forward, and a high level of management in order to make sure that it's repeatable and that the organization can continue to satisfy demand. However, what you tend to find is that once the organization tips over from the main priority being management versus leadership, leadership tends to become less important, management takes hold, and at that point, this is where you can find the point that Janet made, where employees can start to feel disconnected. They can start to feel that they have little control. The organization is very bureaucratic, controlling. They feel less and less able to make a difference, and left when it can go into decline, then obviously management can fall apart. There's many examples of where organizations have overmanaged and underled, and that has contributed towards their decline and their ultimate demise. So that cycle not always follows that format, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about that growth cycle and that growth curve in terms of what's happening in those organizations in terms of leadership and management. I think the important thing for me is the difference between compliance and commitment. This is a quote from Peter Senge from his work, The Dance of Change, and the managers have to understand the fundamental difference between compliance and commitment. It's relatively easy to create compliance by creating processes and systems and audits and controls. However, what we really want is a level of commitment where people will make the right decisions for themselves and will do the right things, so we can focus on driving the business forward and not have to micromanage everything. A model that I like is by a guy called Paul Stewart and a company called On Brand Partners, and it's called the Business Connection Model, and we use this a lot in our work when we're working with new clients to help them to understand the difference between compliance and conviction, because you do need an element of compliance. I'm not saying that compliance is entirely a bad thing. It's not at all. You do need to have some strong processes, and I think on a rational level, that means we need to have a strong vision and goals. We need to have a strategy about how we're going to achieve those goals. Individuals within the organizations need to understand the tasks that are expected of them and how they contribute towards the organization. There need to be measurements in place to measure how the organization is doing and how it's progressing. and there needs to be action. There needs to be a sense of action, and then that people need to know that the organisation is serious. So that's important, I think, in generating compliance within the organisation, which I say is valid. However, it's on the emotional level that people often get a little bit lost and a little bit disconnected. They need to know that there's a strong purpose for the organisation. More and more people coming into organisations now, particularly the younger generation. I sound really old when I say that, but particularly young graduates coming into organisations now are very much more motivated by working for organisations that have a purpose and have a sense of doing good. They want to have, they need to know that there are values in place about how we treat each other, and they need to understand what behaviours are expected of them as well. Measurements are important, but there needs to be a sense of encouragement, and I'm not just talking about financial encouragement, I'm talking about actual spiritual encouragement, managers recognising people doing good work and recognising that publicly. And leaders and everyone needs to be seen to be walking the talk. And that is how commitment is generated. And we have a process that we work with our clients to help audit those different elements. So how much compliance they're being able to generate, but also how much commitment exists within the organisation too. And all of this is absolutely critical, because as we probably all realise and feel at the moment that change and innovation is now the new normal, that we have to be able to change and innovate. No longer can we operate in long periods of steady state. We have to be able to bring innovation into our organisation. So, moving on, I'm conscious of time. I just want to talk now a little bit about how organisations typically react to, or how they try and measure employee engagement, or how they try and contribute towards employee engagement. And if you search employee engagement on Google, I can guarantee the first page will be full of organisations like Gallup, Towers and Perrin, Katz and Kahn, CIPD, Connexa, all providing employee engagement surveys. Now, most of you said that you were part of mature organizations, and I'm not going to actually do this by putting any money on the line, but I would wager that many of you do have some form of employee engagement survey to measure metrics, to measure how engaged your employees are, what they think, and also tools like best companies, which is very popular at the moment, Times top 100 companies. Those sorts of things are very, very popular at the moment with many of the clients that I work with. So what I thought we'd ask you is another question. So over to you, Janet. Well, hopefully we'll not have any technical problems this time.
Okay, what I'm going to do is just clear this poll and go on to the next one. Ready? So if you can all be reading through while I open up the poll.
Yeah, so what I'm interested in finding out is if you do have an employee survey, what do you tend to do when you get your results? What's the way that your organisation deals with that? Do you analyse and act upon the data? Do you run focus groups and validate responses? Do you set KPIs for your managers based around the worst performing areas? Do you create project teams to drive improvement, or all of the above, perhaps? So if you can vote using the little box that Janet pointed out earlier, on next to the little hand icon with an A on it at the moment, and just click on that and vote on the one that most closely represents your...
Robert's put his hand up. He wants to ask a question, I think. Oh,
go on, Robert.
Has he gone, Robert? Robert, if you'd like to ask your question, you can click the talk button.
He might have clicked on the wrong button.
I think he might have done. Okay, we won't put him on the spot. Okay, we'll give people a little bit longer to vote.
Yeah.
Actually, I have to say that at the OU we do have a survey that comes out every year. Yeah, so I can vouch
it's
for
very common, very common in organisations. Some do it themselves. Smaller clients of mine use tools like SurveyMonkey. Others have very, very formal, organised surveys. They use Gallup or organisations like that to run it for them.
Yes, I think
so we've got a few in the...
Sorry, I was just going to say we're quite lucky in the OU, because I think actually they do give us a very comprehensive feedback from them as well. Okay, let's see. Shall we open the poll results?
Yeah, go on, go for it.
Okay, just bear with me, everyone.
We've got a couple in the text box as well. We've got a D and an E in the text box. So
a D and an E.
it looks like there's a combination of analysing the data, but a lot of you, all of the above, you do all of those things, which is not atypical, if I'm honest. Right, I'm going to automatically turn off my sharing and then reshare to try and get around the glitch that we've got.
Right, let's. That seems to work well. Yep, we've got you back.
We're back on, are we? Okay.
Yeah, that's
so
perfect.
Back on my screen. Yeah.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you, Craig. I'll shut up now.
Okay, so typically what do? We create a world-class survey, we deploy it, we hold focus groups, we analyse the data, we deliver our plan, we get cross-functional teams together, we secure management buy-in, we cascade, etc. You can read through that, rinse and repeat. As I said, I'm not being disrespectful. I think employee engagement surveys have a purpose, and I think if you don't measure this, you can't do anything about it. But the cycle that organisations tend to follow is like this. Now, as I said, fundamentally that's not wrong, but some of the things that are typically done. Focus on what's not working. That tends to be a focus, and some of you said that, I think, in what you voted for. So we focus on the bad stuff. We focus on what isn't working, our worst performing area. One of my clients has a red, amber, green scoring for their employee engagement, and they immediately focus on what's red, which, okay, fine. The second thing that tends to happen is we will put together a project team. They will dash off. They will pull together a multifunctional, cross-functional team. They'll go off. They'll work on what needs to be fixed. They'll work on it, and they'll come back with their ideas, and then they'll implement those into the organisation. Often with engagement surveys, it results in lots more extra communication and communication initiatives, which again within themselves are fine. But again, it's something that's happening separate to the rest of the organisation. And then the last thing, or not the last thing, but the other most common thing that happens is that we will cascade that into managers' KPIs. They will have a KPI or a key performance indicator linked to their own bonus or their own performance review, which says that you need to improve employee engagement or employee survey results in your team by X amount. Now, again, I'm not saying that is a bad thing. I don't think I'm a great believer in management by objectives, but also at the same time, I think that sometimes creates some suboptimal behavior within managers, which I've seen a lot of, where they're kind of managing to get the right survey results next time rather than doing what's necessarily right in terms of engaging their employees. So all of those things are valid, but we do tend to get the same old from my experience. So one of the typical reactions that comes around that we find when we talk to managers is whether it's every year or every 2 years, it's something that only happens once or every year or whatever the cycle is. So engagement only really pops up on people's agendas when we are due an audit or we're due our next employee engagement survey. So again, that can create a little bit of cynicism and dread within managers within the organisation, and a sense of again that it's something that we only do when it comes up and pops up on our radar, and it's not something we're doing continuously. Another danger with using employee surveys is it's a lagging indicator. It only tells us how people were feeling in the past. It doesn't tell us how we're doing now. It doesn't get us that instant feedback. Whilst we may follow it up with focus groups to find out why people said what they said, maybe we should be focusing more looking forward and focusing on the road, looking ahead, rather than looking in our rearview mirrors and wondering what people have said about in the past. Again, I acknowledge that an indicator of what people have felt in the past is probably still an indicator of what can improve in the future, but there is a danger that we're always looking backwards, and actually things can change, and particularly for some of my clients are on a 2-year cycle with their employee engagement survey. As they're getting towards the end of that cycle, they're still working on things that may be 20, 22 months out of date, and things may have moved on since
We've
then.
got a quick question,
and the other
Craig,
thing is that
if you're up for it. DT has said, we tend to run ad hoc surveys, but then the argued lack of resource or lack of will doesn't achieve much improvement. but he does get two, or she does get two more KPIs. I wondered if this was a public sector issue or found in other sectors and industries. So I'm guessing that DT works in the public sector.
Yeah, well, DT, it happens in organisations. I've worked in private and quasi public sector. I would count Royal Mail when I worked there as a public, more of a public sector than a private organisation, because this is going back a few years now. Absolutely, it happens in all types of organisations. I think there is an abundance of collecting data, but then not really having any resource to be able to do anything about it, or seeing it as a separate entity or a separate task from managers' day jobs, and we'll be talking about that a little bit in a moment. I also think the danger, it's a little bit like employee suggestion schemes. You can create a false level of expectation. If you're constantly asking people how they feel and how engaged they are, there is an implicit expectation that you're going to do something with the data that you get, with the results and the feedback that you get. And if they see nothing happening, it actually has the opposite effect of probably increasing cynicism and reducing employee engagement. That's just my personal opinion, but it's not exclusive to the public sector.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the other thing is that we often focus on, one big win or a big prize, really, and that can be often at the expense of some smaller wins. So rather than looking for some small incremental quick wins, organisations tend to go after the big prize. We think we can improve our engagement in this area by 10–15%, rather than trying to improve across a range of areas, or even make further improvements in areas that are amber or green if they use that sort of scaling. So I'm a great believer in looking at engagement as an output rather than an input. I'm looking at I think what organisations need to do is move away from this annual HR measure to a more continuous approach. And actually, linked to the point that was just made there about from that question, is it needs to just become part of the way we do our work, and not this cyclical thing that we go through and we only really talk about. Good managers and good leaders, in my experience, it's part of the way they do things, but I think certainly for younger managers, less experienced managers, and managers who are working in an environment where we only really think about engagement on an annual or a cyclical basis, I think it's very difficult to push against that type of culture. So very much what we try and do is encourage organisations to think about this on a continual basis. So I'm conscious of time.
Well, don't worry, Craig, because we're taking the questions as we go along, so we're okay for time.
Okay.
It's interesting you should say that, actually, because that ties in with what KM has said. We have an annual survey which has been broadly saying the same thing for all the years I've worked there. Despite all the supposed initiatives, nothing seems to change. Yes, there are some firms that are like that, aren't there?
Yeah. I mean, just digressing slightly, one of the things I always find really interesting, and I think this links to this whole culture of doing everything through measurement, which, again, as I say, I'm not anti that. I think measurement and management by objectives is good. But I work with a lot of organisations where, and I'm sure it's the same for many of the people on this webinar, where they have a PDR process, they have a personal development reviews, a written appraisal process. And in a lot of organisations that have that, there is a compliance measure. So have you completed, if you manage people, have you completed 100% of your appraisals for your team, is often a measure. And I think it's really interesting in those organisations who have that measure, whose managers will report, high 90s or 100% of compliance to delivering those performance reviews. In the same organisations, when they run their annual employee survey or biannual employee survey, usually or sometimes there is a question that is worded somewhere along the lines of, over the last year or 6 months, I have had a meaningful conversation about my work and my performance with my line manager. And it's always really interesting in those organisations that it's never 100%, even though 100% compliance is reported to the appraisal process. So somewhere along the line, there has become a disconnect with 100% people have had an appraisal or a performance conversation with their manager, but not all of them have perceived that as a meaningful conversation about their performance and their work with that same manager. So again, in some cases it may be a protest vote against their manager because they didn't like what came out of their performance appraisal. But I think often the gap is significant enough to say it ain't doing what it's meant to do. We're complying, but we aren't actually getting the output that we want from that. Well, I think that's endemic in a lot of organisations.
Yeah. So would that be a tick box type exercise, do you think, then, Craig?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, and that whole and I always, again, I think you need to have a standard process for doing appraisals. So I have lots of clients who everyone's been through appraisal training. They know how to fill the form in. They know the thing they need to enter on the the computer system to say they've done their appraisal. They know how long it should take, and they know all the scripts, but the actual conversation is almost just going through the motion. And I'm not saying that's for everybody, but in a lot of...
Craig, we've lost your sound. Can you click your talk button? Hello, Craig. We've lost you.
Cases, it's like, let's get it over and done with, let's get it out of the way, and let's get you out of here so I can get the next person and do the next one. And when you talk to people, because we do a lot of focus groups in the work that we do, and literally some managers just have that, processing mentality.
Hello, Craig. We've got some
can you hear me now?
Strange feedback. I'm not sure what's going on.
Yeah, it's still there. Hang on. Hello, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah, we've
I'm
got
here.
a bit
Can
of
you
a
hear
loop.
me? Hello.
Hello, Craig. Can you hear me?
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me? Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Craig. Right.
I'm here now. Can you hear me?
I think we're going to have to stop
okay.
sharing for a minute. So apologies, everybody. It seems to have gone wrong again. So if we just if we stop sharing for a bit and then go back.
Okay.
I do apologise, everyone. This is the first time I've done a webinar with the sharing screen, and as I say, it worked absolutely perfectly in rehearsal, but obviously the gremlins are out tonight.
Yeah. How are we doing? Can you see now?
That's better. That's much better.
Okay.
Thank you, Craig.
I think my computer might have decided it was going to back my hard drive up wirelessly, which was probably using some of my bandwidth up, so sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, I'll move on then to really the final part of the presentation, which is to talk about a new approach. And I'm not advocating that that we throw away everything that we just talked about. I think employee surveys are great, and I think this is a way of using your employee surveys, perhaps in a slightly different way, and thinking about how you can maybe change the focus. And I realise that for some of you, you'll probably have to march to the beat of the drum of your HR people, your HR department, who will have very much have the focus on how they want to do these things. But again, if you can maybe build some of this into your practice and the way that you manage and lead your team in a small way in the organisation, maybe you can start to change things. So the first thing I just want to talk about, the first of the final three things I want to talk about, is focusing on what's working. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the principle of appreciative inquiry. It's a technique often used in organizational development, and I use it quite a lot as a facilitator. But it is a useful approach in terms of, rather than looking for what isn't working, let's look for what is working. Let's find where those green scores are on our employee survey, rather than just dashing immediately to look at the holes that we've got. Maybe let's look where we've got some really good stuff happening, where we're really obviously getting it right, and see what we can learn from that, and see if we can amplify some of that stuff. And actually, I'm a great believer in the principle of a rising tide raises all ships. If we can catch more people doing the right thing, and encourage more people within the organisation to adopt some of that good practice, and some of those good approaches that are happening within the organisation, maybe, just maybe, we can bootstrap everything else up to that level, rather than just diving straight in to try and fill all the holes that we see within the organisation. So I think appreciative inquiry, looking for where we've got really good green scores, high scores, going finding those managers and those people who are really, really doing that really well, and finding out what we can learn from them, is a really, really important approach that any organisation can take. It doesn't require a high degree of sophistication to be able to do something like that. And I'll share some ideas on how I've seen that done in a moment. The second thing is about what I call changing the conversation. I'll let you read the quote there on the screen. This is from a client of ours who we sort of had to write this down as he was saying it, because it was exactly aligned with the way we see things. And it's really the fact that if we really want to change the culture within our organisation, I think the culture is the sum total of the conversations that take place within it. It's the net amount of conversations taking place in corridors, around water coolers, around in the canteens and in the hallways, around the desks where people are working. Unless we do something to try and change those conversations and change them to the nature of the organisation conversations that we want to take place, we have to accept that the culture of the organisation is not going to change. So often we'll go out and we'll do some really nice PowerPoint presentations, but we'll ignore the fact that we need to be having regular conversations with people on a day-to-day basis about the type of organisation that we're trying to create, and also talking about some of these good practices that are taking place within other teams and not just focusing in our own backyard. So changing the conversation in an organisation is really important, and it's something that needs to happen consciously. And again, I'll share a couple of tools with you at the end of the webinar that we use that do that. And the final one of the three is that we need to look at the approach that we're taking. All too often, as I've said, that we need to, particularly with employee engagement surveys and such like, there's a high annual or biannual focus. There's a big big focus for a short period of time. There's maybe a high initial impact, but after a period of time, the focus tends to drop off and the momentum tails away. It's how do you keep that conversation going? How do you keep that momentum going after the initial excitement of the results coming out and the focus groups and the action plans wears away? And you've got to build that, for me, into regular routines. So one of the questions we had earlier from one of the attendees was around the same things keep coming up time and time again and nothing ever happens. Or maybe we have this initial flush of excitement and then excitement, interest wanes away. It's how do we build that into our day-to-day routines as managers so that we're actually doing it all the time. One of the approaches that we've seen work really well, and some of you who've worked in quality environments will recognize this as very similar to a quality circle approach, but this is focusing more on cultural issues than it is on process issues. Is to build these sort of routines into managers' meetings. So when they're meeting with their teams, they're bringing to the team outside data, performance information from how the company or the organization is performing. They're spending time discussing that. They're exploring how well and where they're doing that well within their own team, and then they're sharing good practice amongst the team to ensure that all the good work that the individuals may be doing but haven't had the time or the opportunity to share with their colleagues is being shared to drive performance throughout the organization. So again, it's a way of building these dialogues into this dialogue process into day-to-day working practices. So I'm just going to finish off with just a couple of tools that we use. I've been giving you some general principles, but I know people often like to see some specific approaches and how they work. So when it comes to building alignment around a vision and particularly around a new strategy within an organization, a tool that we use, we work in partnership with an organization called Big Picture Learning on this, is a tool called Learning Maps. Learning Maps are very rich. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm very much into visual approaches to learning and to facilitating. Very rich pictures depicting the organization's strategy and direction with a very structured dialogue which managers can use initially to communicate the vision, but then also on an ongoing basis to facilitate additional conversations about how everybody can contribute towards that, and also some of these improvement conversations that I've just been talking about to keep the momentum going. We find that having this continual reference back to an experience that everyone else had going through the vision and understanding the strategy, and then understanding the contribution that they can make to it and building that into day-to-day or weekly routines, actually again is a way of sustaining this level of engagement over a longer period, because people have a common frame of reference. They have a common understanding of what their team is contributing to. And again, we've seen organizations who've used this approach go from levels of engage, in the employee survey before we've used this approach. Do I understand the direction and strategy of the organization, which they've rated maybe in the 40s or 50s, go up into the high 70s and 80s in their employee engagement survey. So again, I sort of contradicting myself in terms of focusing on what's not working, but again, once they've established this, then they can amplify some of these messages. And I know the other thing that that Janet has circulated around to explain to you is not just the B book, but we've used in the past other metaphors or structured metaphors. A book that we're very big fans of is Our Iceberg is Melting, which is some of you may be familiar with, a book by John Cotter, which is a story of a penguin colony. Using stories like that, Who Moved My Cheese is another example. There are many more out there. Helping people to use an analogy which is non-threatening and also inclusive can be a really good way of getting them to reflect on some of the limitations or strengths that their own organisation has compared with the story that you are sharing with them. And that's why we wrote the B book. Now, I know Janet has got some copies of that, which you're going to do a prize draw and give away.
Yes, we are indeed. And if anybody wants to email me, I can put you into the draw for that. And I have to say, Craig, I love the characters. And my favourite, well, not my favourite, but the one I have definitely come across, not in the OU, I'm glad to say, but in other places, is Mr. Wingett.
Mr. Wingett, yes, yeah, absolutely. And Lead Bottom as well. He's another character that a few people recognise. They have their own equivalents in their own organisation as well. Yeah. Anyway, again, other animal metaphors exist. I'm not just plugging the B book. The idea of using stories to help people, just change the dialogue within their organisations is really, really important. So I just want to summarise and then hand over just to see if we've got any more questions, if anyone has any specific questions. So just to summarise what we've been talking about, and hopefully the points that I've got across to you, that engagement does matter. The data's out there. If any of you are looking for data to back up the importance of employee engagement and you can't find it, you get in touch with me either via Janice directly. Happy to help with that. But it's out there. There's plenty of data that says it is important. There is this paradox that smaller organisations have higher level engagements, but I don't think that's a natural consequence, as we talked about and Janet pointed out, that it's easier when we're smaller, it's easier to stay connected. I think you can get that in larger organisations. It requires more conscious effort, but you can do it. And some of you, I'm sure many of you, work in organisations that are already quite good at that or good at it already. We need to be able to rediscover the things that we could easily do in the past. We need to find, what was it that we used to do well? It was easy to communicate. It was easy for us to understand what we're trying to deliver. It was easy for us to connect with the overall purpose of the organisation. We need to get away from this mentality of tick box and compliance and try and start to build some genuine commitment. As I said earlier, we need to start thinking about people's values, their behaviours. We need to start having proper conversations about that. Engagement surveys are important. If you don't measure it, you don't know what's happening. It's all left to intuition and gut feel, but you've got to be very careful, and some of you alluded to the fact that it can drive some suboptimal behaviours and actions. And among other things, my 3 top tips, I could give you many more, but I don't have time, is to take an appreciative approach. When you get your results next time around, it may be a few months, it may be a few weeks, or maybe imminent. Have a look at what's working. Don't just jump onto the red numbers. Although you may be encouraged to do that by your senior managers or your HR department, have a look at what's working and think, actually, who's doing that really well that I know, and what can we learn from them? Spend some time trying to think about the conversation, listening, tune into the conversations that are going on around your office and around with your colleagues and also within your team. What are people talking about, and what can you do to try and change that conversation to be more geared towards what the organisation needs those people to be talking about, but also how can it be more engaged? And finally, thinking about employee engagement not as this cyclical once a year, every 2 year thing, trying to think about how you can embed it into your routines, how you can build in some more dialogue, how you can build in some more conversations with your teams and start to make it part of what you do, how you can connect with your people and start to find out for them what is important and how you can help them to really engage with what the organization is trying to do. I know that can be difficult, but I think it's absolutely essential. So I'm also happy to take any questions that we don't cover. If anyone wants to make a note of my email address and drop me a note to ask me anything personally, or if anyone would like me to point you in the direction of any other data, or I've written a few blogs on the topic as well, which you can find on our website. But I'm happy to field any questions that we've got in the remaining time that we've got left together.
Okay, thank you very much, Craig. I don't think there are any questions at the moment. I think people are keen to get to their evenings. Thank you very much indeed for battling with all the gremlins, and thank you everybody who stayed online. I know one or two of you have had a few problems, so I appreciate you staying. We will be providing the recording afterwards, and Craig will give us a PDF of some of his slides. So thank you all. It just remains to say good night and thanks again.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.